Right, Pete. Now we're on to the third section now, and I think you can put this in the context of your outline, but I think, so we've dealt with some of the input issues very helpfully, and now I think you said we're going to move on to the output one. So.
Yeah, if at the moment we're sort of dwelling on, we're all getting miserable, no doubt, because we're dwelling on the problem side, and we, as you say, we dealt with the input. So let's think about some of these output problems. Well, I guess outputs are, I would define those things as emissions, if you like. We talked about inbound supply chains and population, skills and so forth, but on the output side, the biggest one, of course, is carbon dioxide. We had earlier scares, of course, most notably the depletion of the ozone layer. I think that's now there are still people that think that that's not entirely cured, but at least it's abated. And we saw there the resilience of the system in being able to completely redesign fridge systems. Fortunately, it's a lot easier, or it was a lot easier then, before fridges became widely introduced into places like China and so on, but nevertheless the world can react quite quickly once it knows that the chips are down. So carbon dioxide is clearly a big issue, and although I tend to be impatient about this pace of change, nevertheless we can see a remarkably heightened awareness both corporately and individually over the last decade, both in terms of scepticism as well as those that see it as an opportunity. And I think there are very few manufacturers now that aren't aware of the fact that they've got to move to lowered CO2 intensity in their business. That's particularly the case in the developed economies. Of course, it's like our dash for gas in China. They're sort of saying, well, yes, okay, we've got to be able to afford those adjustments to the way that we do things. So at the moment we're going maybe for another decade, and clearly their CO2 emissions in terms of the gross amount, not necessarily per capita, will be rising, but one has to accept their logic that they have to industrialise on the old technology base before they can deindustrialise in terms of emissions at least, from the point of view of affordability. But I think the science now is well proven. In my most cynical moments, I guess that one of the big sticks in this approach may come from the impact of global warming, which will be, if you like, natural disasters. And I don't think that the weather is appointed to that, but clearly there have been an increased intensity of incidents around weather broadly. And there are even those that point to increased volcanicity as a reflection of the way that the melting ice sheets are beginning possibly to impact on tectonic plates in terms of the mass of material that's pressing down on them. Who knows? The other big issue, I think, as opposed to, if you like, the gaseous ones or the global warming potential in the atmosphere, is the issue of inorganic pollution as an output. So most notably here, I think the biggest risk is around phosphates and around runoff, because we are effectively now, in the Victorians use guano, we then move to inorganic nitrogen to give us the food yields that we're currently enjoying. But now there's increasing concern around the runoff of those inorganics as we reach the saturation limits in soils. So that's a big issue, and it's leading to algal blooms, it's leading to nitrates in drinking water, so that's a big output issue. The other output issue, which is a side effect of that perhaps, is the associated issue of the depletion of carbon in the soils. That carbon's been transferred into food, and it's not been replaced in terms of soil structures, so we've got an output issue around food that's associated with more and more soil depletion, erosion, and rapid soil loss into the seas. The next issue I'd highlight there for people to think about would be around the sort of culture of consumption. At the moment we're in a framework where people are in the developed economies being encouraged to consume stuff, and there are significant question marks around the reason for that, and how, if you like, the wants profile of us as psychological beings is satisfied. You know, and then there's a big debate going on, which I'm not qualified to enter, around what drives human aspirations and so forth. But no doubt the scale of consumption is a big challenge. On the other hand, there are benefits. If we look at mobile phones and miniaturization, information technology, then generally what we've seen is an immense leap forward in human creativity, communication, and indeed mechanisms for political change that are actually extremely beneficial, with a considerably reduced physical impact on global resources.
And in fact, something like the Internet and World Wide Web could not only cause problems in terms of cyber war and so on, but also be part of the solution in terms of spreading knowledge and information around the world to deal with these problems.
Exactly, because we'll be talking later, I suspect, about timing and available time in this process. Unfortunately, of course, because of the issues I raised earlier about data, we're not sure. There are significant downsides to the IT revolution, most notably around data banks and the immense energy loads that they place upon the system in terms of electricity consumption for cooling and data movement. And the second big area there that I suspect needs more information and needs addressing is the whole issue of functionality driven by heavy metals, particularly anything ending in IUM, and the political baggage that brings in terms of employment and working methods, particularly in Central Africa, where many of these metals appear to be found. And then finally, the other big output, of course, is the straightforward issue of waste, pollution, whether it's controlled waste in the form of certainly the way waste is managed in the developed economies. Many of the developing economies are still going for deep burial and landfill. We're seeing the beginnings of resource recovery and reuse, which is good. So we're tackling the output problem. And in the UK, we moved from 100% dependency on landfill in the 90s to only around 50 and falling % dependency in the case of all waste streams in the UK. So that's one form of pollution. The one that I've recently become very interested in, largely as a result of being invited to lecture on the subject by the they're non-governmental organisations with an interest in the oceans, is the physical pollution of the oceans. We got very emotional about oil spills recently, but a far more insidious problem in the world's oceans is plastic, both floating and on the seabed, and indeed the plastic that gets ground up into a sort of soup that operates in the middle layers. And at the Ocean Conservancy conference in Hawaii earlier this year, I was presented with some pretty horrific information about the massive tonnage of plastic that's out there and the impact that it's having on global populations of turtles and wandering albatrosses in particular, the impact on corals, and the impact, and the effects in terms of migratory species and bird life generally. I think the fishing industry is severely implicated there in terms of both disposal and the practice of long lining and so on. So that for me would be a big area in which to focus global attention first and foremost. So not a very encouraging list maybe, but one that demands lots of work on the output area. And I guess in the next section we can then start thinking more proactively about the solutions.
Great, thank you very much, Pete.